where so-and-so did what was right in the eyes of God. He was pleasing. He was this. He was that. He's being affirmed. However, the high places still remained. But it doesn't seem to be enough to cast a negative or condemning sentence on that guy's reign. Okay? It doesn't seem to do that. It's just noted. That's interesting. You'll notice a little bit later on when you get to the second page, I did not have a section that I usually do, questions to ponder. I couldn't fully develop it yet. I was in the process, but this is one of the questions I would say it's one to ponder. These descriptions, why do they seem to focus on the good and conclude with them being good, and yet there's still that hiccup there? Uriah the Hittite, high places remain. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit when we get to the end of the summations, because I want your input and feedback on that, okay? I have got a couple thoughts myself, but I want to save that to, I just want to note it here in case I forget to bring that up. You're going to remind me, right? Okay, right, okay. Now, that's his general assessment as a king. When Jeroboam, king of Israel, died 2 years after Asa became king of Judah, his son Nadab became king of Israel. But Nadab was quickly overtaken and killed by Baasha after only 2 years. When Baasha became king of Israel, he killed off all of Jeroboam's family line, fulfilling Ahijah's prophecy from before. This is in verse 30. We read, "This happened because of the sins Jeroboam had committed and had caused Israel to commit, and because he aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel." Of course, it's in verse 29 that says this fulfilled that word from the prophet. Okay. Asa was in war against Baasha constantly. One of the things you'll also notice that seems to be a typical pattern here is, although you're referencing off of each other's kingdoms, in the such and such year of the king of Israel, king of Judah did this, or vice versa, it seems no matter who got replaced, there's constant friction between those two kingdoms all the time. Did you notice that? There's still war. There's still battle. Baasha fortified a place called Ramah, which prevented anyone from entering or leaving Judah. It must have been in a strategic location where it was a frequented passageway, because he's wanting to lock down. He's wanting to lock down that kingdom. And Asa responded by offering silver and gold to the king of Aram by the name of Ben-Hadad to break off their treaty that they had with Israel and to establish a new treaty with Judah instead, to which Ben-Hadad agreed to do. And when he did that, Ben-Hadad began to attack some of the towns of Israel, including the territories of Dan and Naphtali. These are two of the tribes, forcing Baasha to withdraw from fortifying Ramah and retreating to Tirzah, which seems to be where head of operations tends to be right now for Israel. And then what Asa did next was he sent raiding parties to go over to wherever this Ramah was, and let's go get all the stones and the timber that they were using to fortify that, and we'll bring them and use them here in the kingdom of Judah. And we'll fortify places like Geba in Benjamin and Mizpah. So they went and took those building materials and helped themselves, and now they're fortifying some of their places. Asa died from complications from a disease in the feet. I thought that was kind of interesting. His son Jehoshaphat became king of Judah. Baasha reigned as king of Israel for 24 years, with this summary, verse 34. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. Now, I want to emphasize this, committing the same sin. Keep that in mind, because I want to come back to that little reference later. Now, what were some of the sins? Well, obviously, the building up of the idols and shrines at Dan and Bethel, and the high places that are established. These were the types, the same kinds of sins Jeroboam was committing, and is what he is committing. That's chapter 15. So let's move on to chapter 16. Okay, chapter 16 starts off with this, and if you noticed, chapter 16, the chapter break kind of interrupts chapter 15, because we're talking about Baasha, and then it moves into the next chapter. This is probably where the chapter break could have gone a little bit earlier, but it is at what it is. So here in chapter 16, we have this word of the Lord for Baasha that comes from a prophet by the name of Jehu. And here we have it, chapter 16. Let's read together verses 2 through 4. I lifted you up from the dust and appointed you ruler over my people Israel, but you followed the ways of Jeroboam and caused my people Israel to sin and to arouse my anger by their sins. So I'm about to wipe out Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like that of Jeroboam son of Nebat. Dogs will eat those belongings to Baasha who die in the city, and birds will feed on those who die in the country. Now, what one thing do we know for sure whenever God makes a decree like this about what the end of somebody's life is going to be, or someone's generation? It always comes to pass, right? It always comes to pass. That's very interesting. When Baasha died, his son Elah became king of Israel. This is in Asa's 26th year reigning as king of Judah. One day, Zimri, one of Elah's commanding officers, decided to kill Elah, who was getting drunk while he was at Tirzah in his second year as king. He's not there for very long, is he? And he's getting drunk, and he's susceptible to the attack and is killed. All right. Zimri became king of Israel in Asa's 27th year as king of Judah. And upon taking the throne, Zimri killed off all of Baasha's family line. We've seen this already before, right? Why would you do that as king? Why do you kill off the family line? Whatever, right, there's ancestral rights maybe to that throne that you want to cut off. Let's just kill off all the descendants of whoever this progenitor is of this particular family. But Zimri went a little further. Did you notice this is kind of a friends and family list? Did y'all catch that? He kills off all of Baasha's family line as well as his friends, fulfilling Jehu's prophecy against Baasha. If you thought Elah's reign was short-lived, Zimri's was only 7 days. An army of Israel had learned about the rebellion against Baasha's household. They were over at a place called Gibbethon fighting the Philistines, and one of the commanding officers, Omri, led the army to abandon that post and go back and find Zimri back at Tirzah, where he had been deposing the other king 7 days earlier. They lay siege to Tirzah. Zimri discovers it's a losing situation for him, and what's he decide to do? Sets the royal palace on fire all around him, and he dies in the fire. He saw that the city had been overtaken. Let's read the ending of chapter 16, verse 18, and also verse 19. The ending of verse 18. So he died. And then 19, because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. I find that interesting from the respect that, well, he set the fire. He probably knew what he was doing, intentionally committing suicide. That's the way I'm reading it anyway. But it says that he died because of the sins that were committed. Like this is God's punishment for him. So it's not so much that God set a fire, but things had already been set in motion that was going to determine what decisions he was going to make, which would ultimately end in his end, is the way to put it, I guess. All right, next page. I'm Paul Harvey, page 21. Y'all remember those references to the pages in Paul Harvey's cast? Okay. I don't have any young people here to describe who Paul Harvey was. Haley's usually here, or Morgan. And I always like to say, Amy, do you remember Paul Harvey? Now, you should feel flattered because I just picked you out as the youngest person here. So, I believe you are. Are you? Oh, well. I can't explain it to a baby. Oh, well, he's on another level. You've heard of Paul Harvey? Oh, yeah, you would know that part of it. That's the only part you know, isn't it? The rest of the story, okay. Where's Haley when I need her? Down where was I? Because I got off there. Okay, page 21, yeah. Okay, for a brief moment, did you get a copy? So we're on the second page, just summarizing these two chapters. For a brief moment, Israel itself was divided on who they wanted to be their next king. So there's a little bit, okay, you got a divided kingdom. There's two kingdoms. Now you got a kingdom that's kind of divided itself. And one side wanted a guy named Tibni, and the other half wanted Omri, but Omri had better support, and obviously it looks like they killed off Tibni, so now we've got Omri. He becomes king of Israel, and Asa's 31st year is king of Judah. Omri reigned 12 years, and then he died. For 6 years, he reigned in Tirzah. That's where the royal palace had been till it burned down, of course, but still operating as capital. But he had bought a hill in Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built the city on it, calling it Samaria, named after the former owner, Shemer. Well, you've heard of Samaria before, and now you know. And from this point forward, Samaria will be acting as one of those lead towns for the northern kingdom of Israel. And it will become, I'm going to give you a couple of things that this is kind of not related to 1st and 2nd Kings, but when you go to the books of poetry and some of the prophets, you will notice in poetic form, prophets will refer to the kingdom of Israel by 2 other names besides this kingdom of Israel. One is it'll be referenced as Ephraim. How many of you knew that? Ephraim versus Judah. And that is because Ephraim was the most prominent of the 10 northern tribes, most dominant and prominent. But the other one, also comparing the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, sometimes Samaria is used to have a representation context to all of Israel. So Samaria will refer to Israel in poetic sense. So you'll see these in the book of poetry, the books of wisdom. You'll see this in some of the prophets, particularly the minor prophets. When you go to Hosea and I think Amos maybe, and I can't name all the others that will use this kind of form of designation that's for Israel. Just a little bit heads up. And of course, by the time you get the New Testament times, Samaria is the known place where what was known as the half-breeds would be, the mixed race between Jewish-Gentile relationships. Jews would call inhabitants of Samaria dogs. And this is why it was such a significant event whenever Jesus and his disciples stopped at the well that day and began to speak to the woman at that well that Jacob had dug, because she was a woman and she was a Samaritan woman. There's Haley. You've heard of Paul Harvey, right? Okay. Omri, that was random, wasn't it? The assessment of Omri's reign is here in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 16. Oh, I need to turn the page of my Bible to get that one. But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all these before him. He followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. Now, something that I made you make a note of just a few moments ago was, remember that phrase, committing the same sins as Jeroboam. This said something different, didn't it? This says what? More than. It had progressed. It's not the same equal amount as Jeroboam. It's now even more than what Jeroboam did. We don't know what particular things made this representation or assessment to use this adjective, but it's worse than it was from the other one. So I find that being a progression, or maybe what we would rather call a regression, probably. Omri's son Ahab becomes the next king of Israel. This is in Asa's 38th year as king of Judah. You're keeping all this straight, right? If you really are one of those type A personalities, this will bug you to death. Like, now let's see, where was this at here and there? And it's best that you just take a big roll of paper and you just draw a line here for the kings of the north, and you put the X on it whenever the king of the south starts, and you just make those references. Then you'll visualize it. It's hard to see it just in text, how it all differentiates, but here we are, keeping it straight. Omri's son Ahab. Does Ahab ring a bell? And what bell does it ring? Jezebel and Elijah. Just for a quick second here, take a look at your subheading for chapter 17. We're setting up for some big stories, aren't we? This is the beginning of Ahab and, of course, Jezebel. All right. Here is Ahab's description as king, and he is one that already his reputation precedes him probably, but let's read the description given here as 1 Kings puts it. This is verses 30 through 31. It says, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. See, now we're even going further. Same sin, even more beyond that than any of those before him. Verse 31, he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Oh, that's like I hate to use this meme as an example. Probably some of you wouldn't. Man, I better not use that meme because, yeah, I'm not going to use that meme. Lee, I'll tell you later. Yeah, I was exactly thinking here. Hold my beer. That came from my mom, by the way. You think that was nothing? Wait till you see this. How many of you seen memes where it says "Hold my beer"? Have y'all seen? Y'all know what? Okay, see, it hits only a few here, but it's a meme comparison we have. You think that's bad? Just wait till this happens. It's kind of like the other day I saw something about COVID-19, and then monkeypox came along and says, if you think that was bad, wait till this comes around. You know, you get the idea what it's. Right, now we are going to a poker reference, so I'm in trouble. We're gambling, and now we're drinking and gambling. That's what we do on Wednesday nights. Sorry, online audience. But I think it's sad, and yet it's funny that this is how he considered it. That Jeroboam, that's trivial. That was nothing. You know, wait till you see what I can do. Okay, that's what we have of Ahab. It says he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Now already we had a description. Not only do we have same sin, even more sin, or here we have the sin of Jeroboam was trivial, that was nothing. But we also had the description of this aroused the anger of God. This aroused the anger of God. This guy aroused the anger of God more than anybody ever before him. It's just getting worse, worse, and worse. I mean, entropy is happening here. Things are falling apart. Wheels are coming off the cart, if you get what I mean. Does this relate to anybody today? I'm just wondering, you know. And then we have Ahab reigning for 22 years, during which time a man named Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. And it's almost like this is a disjointed story, like kind of on the side. It's pretty interesting, though, but it's just brought up at this point because it's during Ahab's reign that this guy named Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho, and it says this: the cost of the foundations was his firstborn son, Abiram, and the cost of the gates was his youngest son, Segub. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Either sold into slavery, it cost the life of these two boys, or perhaps in some ritualistic way sacrificed to maybe some idols, but somehow it gained the proceeds from worshipers to fund this project. But what it ultimately was a fulfillment of prophecy that was, and when I read this, I thought, well, wait a minute, there's 500 years between Joshua, son of Nun, and this. But when you go back to Joshua chapter 6, you'll read about a prophecy of whoever rebuilds Jericho is going to pay with the price of their sons. Let's read that together. It's in Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. Joshua 6:26. Remember, Jericho's that first town they come up against. And the walls fall down. Y'all know that story. Joshua 6:26. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. That's about 500 years between the events. I find that remarkable. It is kind of like interesting as that it's, that's thrown into this text, but it's because of the reference of time frame. This happened during this time frame. Okay, that's the summary of those two chapters. Let's just start off with basic talk here. Do you have anything that you want to go ahead and ask about, or do you have anything that you want to make a point about at this point? Do you see the reason why I titled this lesson Like Father, Like Son? And I think we have examples of like father, like son in both negative ways and in a positive way, at least one positive way. And not only do we have examples of how he did just like what his father did, evil, and then we have Asa, who comes along and has the mentality of the buck stops here, I'm doing something different. And then you have those who are doing just like David, the forefather, did. He's being compared to David, a premium example of a father. There is a term I will use in the discussion questions, or it may be in the, I think it's in the discussion questions. I call it, I'll have to go back and look at it because I kind of made this up. I call it, where do I write this? Generational pattern. I call it generational pattern. You know, if you're a history person at all, patterns exist in history, right? You probably are very familiar with the generation that forgets the generation before will end up repeating the same mistakes. If you've ever read the book of Judges, that's a word that appears a lot in the book of Judges. There's some cycles that are happening in Judges. Now, these judges that the book of Judges is about is not like the judge that sat in a courtroom on the judge's bench where you have a jury trial and a thing going on like that. It was more of a term that meant a leader to come up for the occasion, somebody who would rally people back to God, okay? And you know some of these judges, and some of them you may not know. You know that there was a woman who was a judge. You've got Samson, known for his strength. You got Gideon. You've got, who else? Can you name any of them? There's about 15 of them, I think. There was Othniel, Ehud, you know, some off-the-wall names of judges. But what would happen when you read Judges is that there would be this circle or cycle that this generation would be up here on the top, as if closeness to God was best demonstrated by this part of their time cycle. But then that judge would kind of, or the people would kind of get lax, and then it would fall down, and at the bottom another generation would come that didn't know the Lord, and they'd be in the furthest away from God in their relationship. And those are the times in which oppressions would occur. For example, in the story of Gideon, you've got the Midianites that are oppressors of Israel. And so he raises Gideon up as one of these judges to lead against the Midianites. Well, Gideon is one of these judges that kind of helped bring them back out of the pit up to the other side of the circle, as there's some repentance and restoration, and now it comes back up here. But guess what would happen after Gideon died and the next generation comes along? They'd be right back down here. Then he'd raise somebody else up, then he'd come right back up here. And that just was a never-ending cycle. And the book of Judges is about that cycle happening in about 15 different revolutions. I call it generational patternism. That's just my term. There's this idea that apostasy in the Lord's church today is only one generation away from being realized. Have you ever heard that before? We're just one generation away from being from apostasy in the church. Apostasy is the word that means falling away, where we are no longer being blessed as God's people. It's as if Jesus, just like he did with the 7 churches of Asia, saying, if you don't fix this, I'm going to come and remove the lampstand. You know, and this is true of all these churches, except maybe with the one at Philadelphia. There wasn't very much negative reprimands there, but certainly with Laodicea there was, Thyatira there was, and so it's this idea of falling away, where a church could lose its lampstand. It was just an analogy of they're no longer my people. That can happen, can't it? It did happen. Jimmy and Norma, you've been to some of these places in the Holy Lands, and of course, I'm going to ask a question. I may not actually know the answer to this question, but I'm just curious. There was a church in Corinth. There were churches in Galatia. There was a church in Ephesus. I'm talking about the Lord's church. I'm not talking about shrines that later on denominational churches have erected to designate or commemorate this is where that happened or this is where that happened. Did y'all see any churches over there that were New Testament churches? Why? Were you not looking hard enough, or what was your summation of that? Well, you were in a group, okay. Yeah. I mean, we don't have any indication, do we? And this is just, again, I'm not saying I know this with a fair amount of expertise. I mean, I stand to be corrected. I mean, I'm vulnerable to that. But Any of these original churches, or anybody that knows of any of these original churches from New Testament times that still exist? How many of you know of a church personally that no longer exists from our time? I mean, I hate to bring this up. Terrell, this will scare the living daylights out of you, but most every church I've ever preached at, or no more churches are closed. I mean, that's kind of like, who do we got here for this church? Maybe I shouldn't say that. I mean, I started in Caldwell. There's no church there. I started in Cherokee. There's no church there now. Well, they are small towns, yeah. And of course, this church is made up of people who, through consolidation and mergers, have come from Deer Creek, Bremen, and where there were at times churches that existed that were strong. Where was I going with that? Is just the fact that we know that things are not guaranteed to just last forever. You don't just set it in motion. Now you think, okay, but wait, Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, right? But he's not talking about congregations. He's talking about the church in this world will always be here, and it will never be defeated. That's what he's saying. That doesn't mean every church that's ever opened its doors will always open its doors. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on this chapter, these two chapters? Any questions to ponder? Yes, Don. Mm-hmm. You what? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we're talking about Solomon's mom. I mean, we're talking about somebody that David would take in. Of course, it was a sin against her. I mean, he used his power of authority, his position, to influence her. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily call that rape. I'm not sure that we don't know maybe that was or not, but certainly the power of influence was there, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. It could be. I always thought it was funny that her name's Bathsheba. She was taking a bath, but yeah, was she flaunting her stuff out in public? Well, she's on a rooftop, which probably for fellow people in neighborhood nobody would see. Only if you were a man that lived in a palace, probably could you have the advantage point that David had. But is there discretion involved at all? That's a good point. I never really considered that much. But it is interesting. I do think this is true. David's attempt to cover up the sin mainly is focused on what he does with Uriah the Hittite. He's trying to fix the sin his own way by manipulating the circumstances that caused him to either come back and make it look like that's his baby, and that doesn't work out, so I'll send you to the front line. And those are two efforts that failed. Yeah. Well, yeah. I think sometimes maybe the word fix doesn't mean to really repair, but to cover up. Let's fix those books so it doesn't look like we took that money. Right, Aubrey? Let's cook the books, as we would call it. Yeah, let's fix it, okay, or rig it. Maybe rig is a better word. If something can be rigged and it's not really. You're right, though. It didn't really fix anything. It's what we all learn as a kid that when you, right, Kevin? When you tell one lie, what did you have to end up doing? Telling. And then you just keep going and going and going because you've already set the precedent. Well, this train has already left the station. Might as well do what I can to keep it on track, right? So, yeah, and most of the time, that's where when there are other people involved, the stories start to conflict. And the more that the lying happened, the more susceptible you are to somebody through cross-examination figuring out that's not true. It's kind of like the boys who were out driving and playing hooky a little bit, and they get caught and they're brought into the authorities. And the story is we all tell them we had a flat tire, but they all were interrogated separately and say, "Okay, which tire was it?" Which tire was it? All right, let's look at our discussion questions. We've got about 10 minutes here. What are some ways that a father influences a child, whether positively or negatively? Now, I will also say this could go for a mother as well, but what are some ways in which a father influences a child? I'm not really asking a complicated question, and so we can keep answers fairly simple here. Who has an answer here? That's probably the number one answer in my book there. Sam? Behavior. You're just in a disagreeable mood tonight. Right. I find myself saying that just recently. I'm doing premarital classes for my son and his fiance. How do I tell my son to be the kind of husband that he needs to be, knowing he has seen it? You know where this is going, right? And I had to say that. Now, Logan, in this respect, you do as I say, not as you've seen me do. I have to say that. But I'm also grateful, though, he has a picture of a father that does make mistakes and tries to, and bears the responsibilities. Yes, Norma. No, but there's a couple of scenarios similar to this. A Christmas Story, one of my favorite movies in Christmas time, where Ralph, wasn't that his name? Ralphie. You remember You'd Shoot Your Eye Out? Ralphie, they're out in the cold, there's a flat tire in there, and there's a word that comes out of his mouth. And as Ralphie later on is retrospectively narrating his own story as an adult, remember what when his mom says, "Where did you hear that word?" You remember this scene? It's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. Heard it from a friend, and then the mother is on the phone to the mother of the friend just chewing her out. But all that time in narration, the adult Ralphie says, "It actually was what I heard my father say." But he didn't want to say that. And there's a song. Do what? Oh, Cats in the Cradle. Yeah, I've been watching you. Yeah, I want to be like you, Dad. And that makes you feel. It's a sobering thought to think, oh, okay, and he wants to be like me, and I've got to watch what I do now. Or the Cats in the Cradle. I want to be like you, Dad. There's never a time that he shared with him, and now the dad wants to have time shared with him and said, I'm busy, and he realized I grew up just to be like you, Dad, Yeah. So speech, behavior, the way that you try to apologize, the way you talk to your spouse is being watched by your kids. The way you maintain your moral character in the community. Your kids are watching. So you gotta really be careful there. We are told that the father is not guilty of the sins of his son, nor is the son guilty of the sins of the father. That's from Ezekiel 18. We often use that to talk about how we don't inherit our parents' or Adam's sin. It's not the doctrine of total human depravity, in other words. However, it seems that there is definitely an impact when there's generational patterns from one generation to the next. And I just put here, discuss that. I'm not guilty for what my dad did. But if my dad demonstrated some things, I have the capability of learned behavior. In other words, it's not innate, but it's learned behavior. I mean, it's not innate for you to say a cuss word. You learned to say a cuss word if you said a cuss word. It's not innate for you to commit these accountable sins. It's learned stuff through temptation and peer pressure and whatever greed and self-gratification drove you to do it. James talks about how sin culminates in the heart, that's where it starts. But we often want what we've seen modeled before us. So even though I'm not guilty of my dad's sin could be tempting me to do the same thing, to sin. Does that make sense? Anybody else want to discuss that or bring up a point about that? You think the same is true in a positive way, though? I want to follow the model my dad left as a spiritual man. That could be true too. I'm going to follow up with a question here that I don't know if I know the answer to, but it kind of reminds me of a discussion I was having recently on a couple of different occasions this last week. We're talking, for example, in a marriage situation, and this is coming from some authors who've written books on marriage and family dynamics. Have you ever heard of the term of a love bank? A love bank, okay? I think Gary Smalley has talked about that, John Trent, maybe Willard Harley, and yeah. So a love bank is like when you and your spouse are making deposits. That's the compliments, the affection, the courtship, all that, the gifts, the notes, the hand holding, all that stuff, okay? And withdrawals, the remarks that are critical, the reprimanding, the quick-tempered responses. You can make deposits, you can make the withdrawals. There's a principle there that it differs from the financial, since we're using financial terms. In the banking world, for example, if I have a balance in my bank account of $100 and then I go spend 20 of it, to get back to where I was, to the $100 balance mark, what do I have to do? I have to put the 20 back in. In other words, whatever I took out, I've got to replace that exact amount unless I was in the hole, and because I had overdraft privileges, and that's going to cost me more, right? $29.95 for a $2 charge at Shepherd's, and you have to go more. But usually in the banking world, it's that equal. It's debits and credits to get it back to balance, right? All right. In relational dynamics, it's not the same. Did y'all know that? You probably did know this. If you get 3 compliments yesterday, that's a nice hat you're wearing. I like those shoes. Where'd you get that shirt? I want one like that. Why don't you cut your hair? Which one are you going to remember when you get home? Why don't you cut your hair? As if you ought to cut your hair. It doesn't look good. That's the implication, right? Huh? A lot of your deposits get lost? Okay. You want me to look at the schedule for marriage counseling on my calendar? Oh. Well, what my point is, and we've learned this before, that how many compliments does it say that it takes to counter a negative? I was thinking the number 40. It's like you need about 40 compliments to counter every negative. What do you know about that, Terrell? Oh, okay. And I was just going to give the one-word answer because it hurts. It hurts. And you think, okay, but the other ought to make you feel good. It does, but okay, this is simple. My left pinky toe is fine. It doesn't hurt whatsoever. I just now thought of using as an example, but there's nothing there that would tell me hey, my toes over here are doing great. But if I got an ingrown toenail over here, I'm going to for sure remember this. This is ever much on my mind. It's ever before me. It's gnawing on me. The things that are good are not always just right there keeping me reminded, hey, we're good. We're good over here. This foot's fine over here. I know that sounds so silly that I'm using that illustration, but isn't that true? Yeah, and and that's I've had ingrown toenails, so that's something that really is a painful thing. So I want to slap the guy that says, won't you focus on the positives and not the negatives? Because you don't feel the negative that I'm feeling right now. I don't mean to literally slap them. I'm just thinking about it. I don't know. That would be my answer. Anybody else have an answer to Terrell? Why do you think we focus on the negatives and not the positives? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, I think that maybe too there's a little bit of a saturation effect. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The positives seem to spoil us in a way where we expect more the next time. Okay, that's great. You talked about my shirt. Now the next day I showed up at school, I've noticed you didn't say a thing about my shirt. What's wrong with my shirt? You know what I mean? It's like we're expecting it now, and we got spoiled on it. And we have a sense of entitlement. I want somebody to say something good about my shirt every day. And then what do? Get on social media. Hey, look at this shirt. I had 7 likes. Tomorrow, how many likes am I going to want? More than 7, or something's wrong. So we kind of build a false sense of security and fall prey into what we have today in this society is a very narcissistic. We're a narcissistic society that wants our ego stroked, and we want to have the goods, the good compliments and things.
I think he's right, because I think if you get a negative comment, then you doubt the positive ones that were given to you. Do they really like my shirt, or were they just being nice?
And huh?
Not if you're a woman.
Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 or 7:30. Either one will work for me. Yes, I love you. Spoken and shown, by the way. It's got to have both components. But when I was also thinking, and I'm running out of time, so I probably ought to shut it down, but I was thinking in terms of how people find that they could get the attention from the negatives. So they're oftentimes thriving on that because of narcissism, just like the goods. The positives will help me. Sometimes I just need that sense of awareness, and maybe if the negativity is the only thing that can get it, then I'll do that. So I live in drama world all the time, What does it take for someone to stop the generational pattern? This one guy cut down the idols that his own grandmother had built. Let's just go to the things to consider here at the end. These are bottom line points I found to be true from reading these stories of these 2 chapters. It seems to be okay to have made some mistakes in the past as long as your heart and actions remain focused on God. And I think that's true of David. Uriah the Hittite, it's mentioned, but it doesn't cast enough shadow for God to cast him away. And that's because of what we read about in Psalm when he brings a broken heart to him, right? And he restores the salvation to David. Well, right. Exactly. If you continue doing the same things the same way, you will keep getting the same results. And we've heard this before in like some church growth material we've gone through. But here, like father, like son, why are you doing it the way they do it? knowing how it turned out. And especially with the added factor that really is the bottom bullet point I wrote here, fulfilled prophecies always prove that God means what he says. How many times do we read, and this fulfilled a prophecy of Jehu, or this fulfilled a prophecy of Joshua from 500 years ago? Why don't we get that message? That that's what God said would happen if we went this way. And it comes true just exactly the way God says. But why don't we listen, Sam? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. What one generation does affects the next generation. It really does. And that can be positive too. But what we've seen more than times than not, it's negative. And then do not underestimate the power of negative influences. This is happening because of the very failure to do what I mentioned in the sermon on Sunday morning, when they didn't drive out all the inhabitants completely, and that religious, paganistic idolatry infiltrated Israel and influenced them. That's the start of the high places. They did become thorns in their side, barbs in their eyes, or barbs in their eyes, thorns in their side, whatever that passage was. I remember reading that passage out of the book of Numbers. That's exactly what happened. And it is the main reason why you had a divided kingdom, and why they go into exile, and why they keep doing these same mistakes. Next week is, we start with Elijah, and I love the life of Elijah, and Elisha too. And so we're going to start the trailing of that guy's life as a prophet. Hope you'll have a good week. Thanks for joining us on YouTube and Facebook. We'll see you Sunday morning, Lord willing, on a sermon about Job, when life blows you away.